A 143-mile wall of mud and shell is holding back a flood that could wipe $53 billion from the American economy. And for nearly a century, it was designed to fail. That wall encloses a body of water so large it looks like an inland sea, but so shallow it's more like a puddle. Lake Okeechobee, the liquid heart of Florida. For decades, the greatest threat wasn't a hurricane tearing it apart from the outside. It was water, secretly eating it alive from the inside. What the engineers found in the early 2000s was terrifying. The earthen dike, built from porous gravel and sand, was dissolving. A process called piping was carving invisible tunnels through its core. At any moment, a section could give way, releasing a wall of water that would drown the towns and farms south of the lake in minutes. The government knew this. They had a report that gave the dike a 1 in 6 chance of catastrophic failure in any given year. So they made a choice. To keep the water level low enough to prevent a breach, they started dumping it. Billions of gallons of nutrient-packed, pesticide-laced water flushed east and west, straight to Florida's coasts. It was a deliberate act of poisoning, a trade-off to stop a biblical flood. They saved the dike by sacrificing the coasts. This wasn't an accident. It was a plan. Comment below if you've ever seen the blue-green algae blooms on Florida's coasts. We want to hear what you've witnessed. Now, after 18 years and a staggering $1.5 billion, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has finally fixed the dike. A massive, hidden concrete wall has been built inside the old earthen mound. The dam is stronger than ever. The flood bomb has been disarmed. It should have solved everything. It hasn't. If you're watching this story affects you, whether you live in Florida or not. The crisis in our water systems is one of the most underreported stories in the country. A lot of people watch these documentaries and are glad they know, but then they forget to subscribe. We are a small team, and every subscription makes it possible to investigate the next story. Please, take 1 second. It's the single most important way to support this channel, and it's free. We need you to hit that button. Don't be one of the people who forgets. Let's begin. The dike was named for a president, Herbert Hoover, but it was born from a nightmare. A nightmare captured not in engineering reports, but in the pages of one of the greatest American novels ever written. Before the dike, there was a different Florida, a single, slow-moving river of grass, flowing from the Kissimmee Basin, pooling in Lake Okeechobee, then spilling gently over its southern rim, trickling down through the Everglades to the Florida Bay. It was a system of perfect, delicate hydrology. Developers in the early 20th century saw that system and decided it was an obstacle to progress, to real estate, to profit. They built small, flimsy walls of dredged muck around the southern rim of the lake to hold the water back and drain the land for farming. Then the sky turned dark. On September 18, 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane churned across the state. The storm surge in the lake easily breached the pathetic muck levee, sending a wave of water into the town of Moore Haven. Hundreds died, but that was just a dress rehearsal. 2 years later, to the week, on September 16, 1928, the Okeechobee hurricane made landfall. It was a monster. As the Category 4 storm passed over the massive, shallow lake, its winds pushed the water into a colossal surge, up to 20 feet high. The wall of water didn't just breach the southern levee, it annihilated it. The flood that poured out was instantaneous and absolute. It swallowed an entire landscape. Homes, farms, and lives were erased in an afternoon. The people who lived there were mostly migrant farm workers, many of them black. Their deaths were unrecorded, their bodies lost to the water and the muck. The official death toll was high. The real toll was almost certainly higher. Estimates range from 2,500 to 3,000 souls. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. A tragedy so profound it became the climatic, terrifying event in Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 masterpiece, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She gave a voice to the people the flood tried to silence. The disaster shocked the nation. President-elect Herbert Hoover personally toured the devastated landscape. He saw the bodies, he smelled the decay, and he promised federal action. Congress responded with the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1930, authorizing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build a real levee, a permanent solution. They began construction in 1932. Using hydraulic dredges, they sucked up the most convenient material available. The same gravel, rock, limestone, sand, and shell that made up the lake bed itself. They piled it high, creating a wall that stretched for miles. Even then, some engineers knew. They knew this material was permeable. They knew it could be eaten away by water. But it was cheap, it was fast, and the political mandate was clear: stop the flooding, at any cost. They had just built a ticking time bomb and buried the clock. This story is incredibly complex, with decades of engineering decisions and environmental consequences. If anything you've heard so far surprises you, let us know in the comments. What part of this history were you never told? The first sections of the dike were finished by 1938. In 1947, another major hurricane flooded South Florida for weeks, proving the initial work was not enough. So Congress authorized a massive expansion. The project grew, wrapping nearly the entire 143-mile perimeter of the lake. By 1960, the structure was complete and officially named the Herbert Hoover Dike. An American flag was raised. A ribbon was cut. The monster had been caged. Florida was safe. It wasn't. It never was. For decades, the dike held. It did its job. It prevented flooding, and in doing so, created modern South Florida. The Everglades agricultural area, a 700,000-acre tract of incredibly fertile farmland south of the lake, was born. Sugarcane became king. Cities grew. Population boomed. An entire economy was built on the assumption that the dike was invincible. Then, in the early 2000s, engineers performing routine checks started seeing things that didn't make sense. Water was appearing in places it shouldn't be. Small seeps, muddy patches on the dry side of the levee. The instruments told a story of mounting pressure deep inside the dike's foundation. The truth began to dawn, slowly at first, then with horrifying speed. The dike wasn't just old. It was actively failing. The enemy had a name: piping. It's the most insidious form of dam failure. It doesn't happen with a dramatic crash. It happens in silence, in darkness, deep underground. Water from the lake, under immense pressure, finds a weak point in the foundation. It pushes a single grain of sand out of the way. Then another, and another. A tiny trickle becomes a small flow, carving a microscopic tunnel. The tunnel grows, carrying away more and more material from the core of the dam. On the surface, nothing looks wrong, until the hollowed-out cavity inside becomes so large that the sheer weight of the structure above it causes a sudden, total collapse. A 2006 report commissioned by the South Florida Water Management District was blunt. The current condition of Herbert Hoover poses a grave and imminent danger, needs to be fixed. We can only add that it needs to be fixed now, and it needs to be fixed right. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers quietly placed the Herbert Hoover Dike on its list of the top 6 most dangerous dams in the United States. Privately, they calculated the risk of a breach at 1 in 6. A roll of the dice. Every year, with hundreds of thousands of lives and tens of billions of dollars in the balance. The Corps was now facing a nightmare scenario. Fixing the 143-mile dike would take decades and billions of dollars. But they couldn't wait. They had to do something immediately to reduce the risk. The only variable they could control wasn't the dike itself, it was the water. The solution was brutal and simple: lower the pressure. In 2008, the Corps implemented a new rulebook for the lake, the Lake Okeechobee Regulation Schedule, or LRA-08. Its primary goal was to keep the lake's water level artificially low, between 12.5 and 15.5 feet. By keeping the lake emptier, there would be less pressure pushing against the fatally weak foundation. It was battlefield medicine, an emergency tourniquet applied to a festering wound. But when a lake that's the central hub of a massive watershed is kept artificially low, where does the excess water go? In a natural system, it would flow south. But the dike had permanently blocked that path decades ago. There were only 2 other options: east, through the St. Lucie Canal to the Atlantic Ocean, and west, down the Caloosahatchee River to the Gulf of Mexico. And the water they were forced to release was poison. Decades of agricultural runoff from farms north of the lake, full of phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers, had accumulated in Lake Okeechobee. It was a giant holding tank for the perfect algae recipe. When the Corps opened the floodgates, they weren't just releasing water, they were releasing a plague. This part of the story is what impacts millions of Floridians, tourists, and business owners. If you know someone who lives on the coast, who fishes, who runs a hotel, or who simply loves the beach, share this video with them. They need to understand why this is happening. Click the share button and the like button. Knowledge is the only defense we have. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The massive slugs of polluted freshwater slammed into the delicate saltwater ecosystems of the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries. The shock alone was damaging, but the nutrients in the water were fuel. They triggered explosive blooms of toxic cyanobacteria, more commonly known as blue-green algae. The water turned into a thick, foul-smelling, guacamole-like sludge. It killed seagrass beds by blocking sunlight. It created dead zones by sucking all the oxygen from the water, suffocating fish, and it was dangerous. In the summer of 2018, the blooms were so intense that tests in the St. Lucie River showed the water was 50 times more toxic than the limit considered safe for human contact by the World Health Organization. The economic devastation was just as severe. Beaches were closed. Tourists canceled vacations. Fishing charters went out of business. Real estate values plummeted. The stench of decay hung over entire towns for months. Even worse, scientists began discovering that the toxins could become airborne. Studies started linking aerosolized cyanobacteria to severe liver damage and a terrifying range of neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS and Alzheimer's. Florida was trapped in a perfect, man-made hell. To stop the dike from bursting and killing thousands in a flood, the government was forced to slowly poison millions on the coasts, a choice between a swift death and a slow one. For more than a decade, this was the policy. Deliberate, calculated, necessary. The plan was audacious. The execution, nearly impossible. How do you fix a 143-mile-long earthen wall that is actively trying to dissolve itself from the inside out, while it's still holding back a 730-square-mile lake? You can't drain the lake. You can't tear the dike down and start over. You have to fix it in place, invisibly. The Army Corps of Engineers knew the enemy was piping. The only way to stop it was to build a barrier inside the dike itself, a permanent, underground wall that would cut off the seepage paths. It's called a cutoff wall. But building one to the scale required at Lake Okeechobee had never been attempted. The primary focus was the most vulnerable southern portion of the dike. The plan was to construct a 21.4-mile-long seepage barrier, a continuous wall of concrete built deep inside the earthen mound. The process was like robotic surgery on a planetary scale. Massive, specialized trenching machines called hydromills were brought in. These machines, weighing hundreds of tons, would crawl along the crest of the dike. They don't dig a trench in the conventional sense. They use two giant, counter-rotating cutting wheels to grind a narrow slot, just 2 feet wide, straight down through the center of the dike. They chewed through the compacted shell, sand, and rock of the original 1930s construction, descending to depths of 70 feet or more, deep into the solid limestone bedrock beneath the dike's foundation. As the hydromill carved its path, the trench it created was simultaneously filled with a thick, engineered slurry made of bentonite clay. This slurry was heavier than groundwater, preventing the trench from collapsing on itself and stopping water from seeping in. It held the earth back while the machine worked. Then came the magic. The slurry was slowly displaced as concrete was pumped into the trench from the bottom up. Not just any concrete, but a specialized, self-hardening mix that would form a single, continuous, monolithic wall. A reinforced spine of immense strength, completely hidden from sight, locked inside the heart of the earthen dam. They had to do this, panel by panel, for over 21 miles. Each new panel had to perfectly interlock with the previous one to ensure there were no gaps. A single flaw, a single weak seam, would defeat the entire purpose. It was slow, brutally expensive, and technically demanding work. They were threading a needle through a mountain, blind. Construction dragged on for years. The cost spiraled from initial estimates to a final price tag of $1.5 billion. It became one of the most expensive dam rehabilitation projects in world history. I know we've already asked, but the data shows that 8 out of 10 people watching right now are not subscribed. We get it. It's the little red button you see on every channel. But for us, it's a lifeline. If you feel like you've learned something important, please, just take a second to click it. It's an emergency for independent channels like ours trying to compete. It helps more than you know. Finally, on January 25th, 2023, it was done. 18 years after the project began, 3 years ahead of its revised schedule, the final section of the cutoff wall was complete. Colonel James L. Booth, the commander of the USACE Jacksonville district, stood at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. "Herbert Hoover Dike has never been in better shape than it is right now," he announced. "It's great news for the lakeside communities." And he was right. The engineering had worked. The impossible had been built. The threat of a catastrophic breach, the ghost of 1928, was finally laid to rest. The lakeside towns of Pahokee, Belglade, and Clewiston were safe. It should have been a moment of unambiguous triumph. But here's what they didn't tell you. Just weeks after the celebration, the Army Corps opened the floodgates and began dumping toxic water on the coasts again. The same blooms, the same stench, the same economic ruin. The outrage was immediate and furious. U.S. Representative Brian Mast, a vocal critic of the Corps' policies, was livid. How could the government spend $1.5 billion to declare the dike safe and then immediately continue the very policy that was only ever justified by the dike being unsafe? Mast compared the Corps' logic to an Army officer using a 15-year-old map to infiltrate an enemy compound when we've got new, confirmed intelligence from this year. It doesn't make any sense. The Corps' defense was bureaucratic. The $1.5 billion project had fixed the dike's structure, but their official operating manual, LRS-08, was still the law of the land. They were legally bound to follow the old, outdated rules written for a failing dam, even though the dam was no longer failing. They had built a Formula One race car and were being forced to drive it at 30 miles per hour. It revealed a deeper truth about the crisis. The weak dike was never the root of the problem. It was a symptom. The real disease was a completely broken plumbing system, a century of environmental malpractice that had turned Florida's river of grass into a toxic toilet. Fixing the dike was like replacing a burst pipe in a house that was already rotten to its foundations. It was a necessary repair, but it didn't save the house. The number isn't $1.5 billion. The real number is $20 billion. That is the estimated cost of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP. It isn't a repair project. It is an attempt to resurrect an entire ecosystem. Passed by Congress in 2000, CERP is a collection of 68 separate but interconnected public works projects. It is one of the most ambitious and expensive environmental restoration efforts ever undertaken by humankind. Its goal is simple to state, but mind-bogglingly complex to achieve: undo a century of damage and restore the natural southward flow of water from Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades. It's about replumbing an entire state. The plan involves building massive new reservoirs south of the lake to store and clean water. It entails constructing huge, man-made wetlands, called stormwater treatment areas, that use native vegetation to naturally filter out the phosphorus and nitrogen before the water is released into the Everglades. It means tearing down old canals and levees that impede flow, and building new ones that direct it. This is the only real, long-term solution to the toxic discharges. If you can store the water south of the lake, clean it, and send it south, you don't need to dump it east and west. You solve the coastal algae crisis while simultaneously rehydrating a starving Everglades and recharging the aquifer that provides drinking water for millions in South Florida. CERP addresses the root cause. The $1.5 billion dike repair was just triage for the most deadly symptom. But CERP is a partnership between the federal government and the state of Florida, and for 20 years, its funding has been inconsistent, its progress agonizingly slow, and its objectives subject to intense political pressure from powerful agricultural interests, particularly the sugarcane industry that dominates the land south of the lake where these projects need to be built. The $20 billion figure, once shocking, is now seen as optimistic. The true cost will likely be far higher, and the timeline for completion stretches for decades. In the meantime, the newly fortified Herbert Hoover Dike represents a new reality. The lake can now safely hold more water. This created the opportunity to finally throw out the old, discredited rulebook. On August 12, 2024, after years of study, modeling, and public outcry, the Army Corps officially signed the Record of Decision for a new manual, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, LOSOM. LOSOM is a paradigm shift. Unlike LRS-08, which prioritized the safety of the dike above all else, LOSOM is designed with a new primary goal: to drastically reduce and eventually eliminate the damaging discharges to the coastal estuaries. It allows the Corps to hold more water in the now secure lake during the dry season, and strategically send more clean water south to the Everglades when possible. It's the first glimmer of hope the coastal communities have had in over a decade, a fragile moment of relief. The engineering of the dike fix is finally being matched by a smarter policy for the water behind it. The tunnel is built, the rulebook is rewritten, the lake is slowly rising, and none of it is enough. The fundamental problem remains. The water flowing into Lake Okeechobee is still polluted. The Kissimmee River, the lake's primary source, drains a 4,400 square mile watershed, filled with cattle ranches, farms, and sprawling suburban development. Every rainfall washes more nutrients into the lake, feeding the next inevitable algae bloom. LOSUM can manage the water better. It cannot make the water clean. And then there is the sky. Climate models for the American Southeast project a future of increasing volatility. More intense hurricanes, capable of dumping unprecedented amounts of rain in a short period. More severe droughts. The new dike was built to withstand the storms of the past, but is it ready for the storms of the future? A single, stationary hurricane could overwhelm the system's capacity, forcing the Corps back into the same impossible choice: release the poison or risk the flood. The Herbert Hoover Dike is no longer a story about failure. It is a story about the staggering cost of a partial success. Florida spent $1.5 billion to buy security, to disarm the flood bomb, but it has been left with something more insidious, a stronger cage for a more toxic monster. The true catastrophe was never just the risk of a flood. It was the century-long chain of decisions that disconnected a state from its own water, that prioritized development over ecology, that turned a life-giving resource into a weapon used against its own people. The dike fix bought time. Time for the multi-billion-dollar Everglades restoration projects to inch forward. Time for new regulations to take hold. Time for a new generation of engineers and policymakers to grapple with the consequences of what their predecessors built. The question that lurks in the deep, dark water of Lake Okeechobee is whether that time will be used wisely.